Muted. There
What a
we
great
go.
way to start.
Hello. Yeah, the great way to start. I muted us so we wouldn't be heard before the intro and then failed to unmute myself. So hello, Sublation Media viewers. It is I, Douglas Lain.
And I'm Ashley Frawley. I'm Associate Professor of Sociology. Well, my official title is Associate Professor of Criminology, Sociology, and Social Policy at Swansea University. And I'm here to talk to you about the myth of the student mental health crisis with my sidekick, Doug. No, I'm kidding. Kidding about Doug. That is correct about what the topic is.
Yeah, okay. And so I'll give you my credentials. I'm a cranky divorced dad. And also, I write some things sometimes, and I run a company called Sublation Media, Sublation Press. I'm a YouTuber and a podcaster, and you all know who I am. So yeah, we're going to be talking about the mental health crisis that's plaguing not just the student bodies across the world, but really all of the world's population, especially in the West. I know that the pandemic created a terrible mental health crisis. Most people are filled with anxiety and depression and probably multi-personality disorder or bipolar disorder or schizophrenia or all of it. I happen to know there's one particular person who has every mental illness that you can have. His name is Junior Egg or J-Reg, but luckily for him, they all cancel each other out. So he'll have, depression and pressured speech so that his intonation is just normal when he talks, because the depression suppresses his, his speech, his compelled speech. But in all seriousness, the mental health is a big topic. People are very concerned about their mental health. Policymakers are concerned about mental health.
Of course they are.
And you have a contrarian perspective about it all, Ashley, and you seem to be almost suggesting that mental health is as a social goal to create a civil, a society that is healthy mentally, that aim is maybe misguided. Like maybe we shouldn't be aiming at creating mental health as a political goal. Is that your position?
Well, yeah, I don't have a contrarian position. I think I have a correct position. I'm not saying anything that's really, really controversial. The thing is that if you just look at what advocacy groups will say and kind of the hype around things, what policymakers will bang on about because it's an easy way to score political points, you can get a very skewed idea of what the actual picture is. And so I just want to shed some light on what the actual picture is so that we don't, when you pick up the newspapers, you have to understand that what you see goes through a long, long process. And I'm not talking, necessarily about, Chomsky and propaganda filters and all these sorts of things, but just that you have advocacy groups who take ownership of issues, and it is in their interest to kind of big them up as much as possible. But we have to kind of look at things a little bit more soberly. So in my forthcoming book, which is apparently due out in February, I have learned. I thought that it was going to come out in 2023, but I just talked to the publisher. It's 2024. Significant Emotions, Rhetoric and Social Problems in a Vulnerable Age. One of my case studies is student mental health. So that's the area that I know the most about. But in general, researching this for 15 years, I can speak to some of the other ways in which mental health categories have expanded, claims making has expanded. It's politically expedient for a variety of reasons. I think just to speak to this sort of political expedience, I think people on the left really like these claims about a mental health crisis because, one, we are very comfortable with health framing of social issues. So it becomes more and more difficult to speak to people at the level of politics. I don't know if you're a communist. I don't know if you're a liberal. I don't know what you are. Maybe you're apolitical. But I do know that you have a body and I can speak to you in the language of health, and that's going to connect with people at the lowest common denominator. So there's that. It has a kind of, I don't want to say the word social justice or the phrase social justice is very loaded now, but it has that kind of social justice framing, like you're solving a problem, you're doing good in the world. It sounds very progressive. And also it the most obvious thing is that it speaks to the left because it's like, well, capitalism makes us mentally ill. It's this big sort of claim. But on the other hand, we should be aware that part of the reason why the idea of a mental health crisis is so powerful and so many groups take ownership of it and bang on about it is because it talks to everyone across the political spectrum. So it also speaks to the right. And in my research looking at the origins of mental health kind of or counseling services in universities, some of the very first counseling services were started by someone who was an open eugenicist, and it was mental hygiene. And when mental hygiene kind of went out of fashion, mental health, you go on Google Ngram. I invite all of you to go ahead and do that. If I was editing this, I would add a Google Ngram at this point. You can see that as the phrase mental hygiene falls away, the term mental health rises. And there was this idea it was Stuart Patton, one of the very first people to campaign for a home for what is now called a kind of counseling service or well-being service, or depending on what country you're in, mental health services on university campuses. Part of his claims making was this idea that a lack of mental hygiene in the population explained all sorts of problems, all sorts of social problems. He even thought it could explain like attempted assassinations on like a sort of general lack of hygiene could explain attempted assassinations, opposition to the First World War. And there was also a general sense among states that they were sort of receptive to this idea of promoting mental hygiene because it would produce better soldiers and people who would have mental fortitude in war. So there's a long sort of not particularly left-wing history to this sort of idea of the mental hygiene movement. Now, up toward the present, it has a tendency, it has the language of mental health, or the framing of mental health has the ability to depoliticize social issues and to kind of translate them into the safe language of health. And I use this example all the time. People who watch will have heard me, but I went on this show called The Big Questions in the UK. It's a BBC show, and Sophie Howe was on the panel with me, or a bunch of people at the front, and she's the she was, I don't know if she still is, but at the time she was the Welsh future generation well-being of future generations minister. Somebody in the audience was like, "Oh, it's all well and good for you to talk about well-being and happiness, but we in the Welsh valleys don't have jobs." And she kind of like does some hand waving and that sort of thing. And by the end of it, she's banging on about how what we're really talking about is mental health, the impacts on mental health. And it is a travesty in this country that we cannot get good funding for services. So now, you wanted to have a conversation about
you're breaking
jobs.
up a little bit.
Have a conversation about reality. Now,
start again. So now you said you broke up a little bit there, some sort of internet interference. But anyway, you were saying, she was confronted by someone who wanted to talk about jobs, and she said, "No, this is all about mental health." Take it from there, if you can, if you're not broken up still. Looks like we've got some interference with Ashley. And what I will do is just point out that I think it's kind of absurd that there should be a governmental agency that tackles mental health as a separate issue from health.
I am services. Here. I knew that you were going to lose me. Sorry about that.
What did you do to? Well, you're still breaking up a little.
No.
Well, I was just saying that it's absurd that there should be. Yeah, we're back. Can you hear me now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can you hear? Okay.
I can give a better example.
Give me that better
example. So, another example of depoliticization is student fees. So, go back to 2010. There was an enormous controversy in the UK about the raising of tuition fees up to £9,000. and students had protested. It was a humongous and controversial issue. And a lot of students felt that they had been hoodwinked into voting for a particular party that said that, they were going to do all these sorts of things. And then they aligned with the Tories and they got and introduced tuition fees. And so there's a lot of anger and frustration about these fees. Now, in my research, looking at student mental health and its construction as a problem, the student fees get constructed as just one cause among many of student mental health issues. And this receives no pushback whatsoever. So Sam Gyimah, when he took over as minister for, I can't remember the exact title, but for universities generally, I think it was like technology, something. Anyways, he was bangs on, they're always like they appear to be making a strong stand, right? But they can do that because they're not underwriting it. There's no cost to the government because they're putting the onus on universities. But they're like, universities have a duty of care to students. They have to take care of mental health. And this is non-negotiable. All this strong language. Is conservative minister, by the way. And he says, mental health is the biggest problem facing universities, bigger even than student fees. Nobody says anything about that. Nobody pushes back against that. And he was essentially saying, forget about the fees. It's mental health. That's the biggest issue. And then you even got the absurd situation in which among the causes of a supposed mental health crisis in universities was financial problems caused by fees. Members of counseling service organizations argued against the reduction of fees on the grounds that it would stop paying for very necessary mental health services. So we have to keep the fees high so we can pay for the mental health services, which are alleged to be necessary because of the fees. It just starts to get really absurd, but nobody really talks about student fees anymore. And they pay for an ever escalating spiral in demand. And I can get down to what the so-called student mental health crisis consists of if you want to next.
To what degree have students taken up this framing to think of their issues primarily in terms of mental health?
So you have to understand, too, that what's really interesting is that students have been seeking professional support for mental health issues, what they have been trained to think of as in terms of mental health. Any kind of negative emotion, you're sort of trained to think of that as a mental health problem since they were very young. And yet still, just a slim majority prefer to rely on their informal networks rather than formal forms of support. But it is a very powerful and common, not possible deal with problems on your own. Left to your own devices, even any problem, no matter how small, is quite likely to spiral into something bigger if you don't seek help for it. So this was in my research, was the most common thing. It was like, you might not think that your problems are big enough, but take them to a professional, because if you don't, they will spiral out of control. And then, so students, and then I remember sitting in some of these sessions with university counseling services. We did this British Academy funded study of student mental health services or well-being services. They have all sorts of different names at different universities. And they were like exasperated that students were coming to them for professional support when their dog died. And they're like, wow, students need to know that these things are part of life. And I was like, you fucking told them to do that. This was like this was one of the big claims. It was the most common thing that I identified was, no matter how small the problem, come get support. Support is available. And there's a big part of this story, which is about risk aversion on the part of universities as well. But so students have also been taught since a very young age, particularly in English-speaking countries, they have been subject to what Catherine Eccleston and Dennis Hayes calls the dangerous rise of therapeutic education, which is the name of a book, originally published in 2009, republished in 2019. And they do a very extensive study of the introduction and massive expansion of therapeutic education, through which young people, children, very young children, are invited to kind of sit in a circle, for instance, circle time, and kind of express their feelings. And they are taught that as a good citizen in waiting, you should be constantly self-surveilling. You should be thinking about your own emotions constantly and on the lookout for feelings which become symptoms or potential symptoms of some disorder or some problem or some mental health issue. So we have a medicalization of feelings. And I'm sure people watching know what medicalization means. It's what it sounds like. It's one of the very few sociological terms that have made it into the general sort of lexicon, but it's to make something medical which was not previously considered medical. And so feelings have been largely medicalized. And in one of the quite famous and widely reported National Union of Students surveys, they do this of student mental health, they do this constant slip between feelings and symptoms. So they will ask students about their feelings and they will report on their symptoms. And so there's this constant kind of slippage in the culture. And so it becomes logical that when you have a problem, you start to talk about, or when you have an issue, you have negative feelings, so-called negative feelings, you think, I have a mental health problem. And to whom do you take mental health problems? Well, with a medical framing, you take it to a professional. And so students have been seeking help from professionals in greater and greater numbers since the early 2000s, despite the best studies showing that they do not suffer from medical or diagnosable mental health problems in greater numbers. In fact, they suffer from them in slightly lower numbers than the general population. And yet they seek help much, much more. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wonder about what kinds of metrics there might be, or how people who are pushing this ideology would justify using a therapeutic approach to solve either personal or social problems. Like, if you were to compare a student who deals with their crises or their difficulties that normally would come up in life by seeking expert therapeutic help to those who use their informal social network, would there even be a way to measure success rates in the two different techniques? From, how do they measure success when a student or anyone seeks therapeutic answers to their life
Well,
problems?
this is a huge issue. And I was going to try to cite off the top of my head a much more recent source, but forgive me, I'm going to cite an old one, but it's still a good one. And that is Tana Deneen's Manufacturing Victims. And this is a book from, I believe, could be 1999. It's quite an old book, but it's a very good one. And there was always a line in that stuck with me, and I looked it up recently to see how that has stood the test of time. And that is that there's a persistent issue with interventions designed to, well, there are a lot of issues with measuring the success of interventions designed to produce an improvement on some indicator in terms of mental health. Oh God, where do I start? But the one, it's very difficult to say whether or not people get better because of the intervention or because of time. And time is one of the best. Time is the best healer, right? People tend to get better over time, just generally. You have a problem, and you tend to go and see the professional at the height of that issue. But even if you don't go see a professional, you will still begin to feel better after, like, I suppose, the height or the lowest low. You start to come up out of that generally. And so it is natural to say, oh, this thing really helped me, because you went to seek that help when you were at your lowest low. And so there's a persistent difficulty with that. And Deneen puts out some graphs, or at least the original source that she uses links to some graphs that show the difference in help seeking and non-help seeking, and the way that, like, the intensity of the crisis, it has to be considered, and how long the person has been feeling bad. And once you match that, there isn't really that much benefit from a lot of interventions. Now, I'm not saying that there's no benefit. I think, therapy is the new age confessional. We have lost a lot of our informal relationships, and so there is a value to that formal relationship when you don't have anything else. But I'm just saying that we have a tendency to kind of very much overrate the efficacy of a lot of interventions. The other issue, so time is the best healer. The other issue is that you can kind of select people who are already not that sick to begin with. So the ideal patient is someone who is intelligent, well-spoken, is on board with the framing that the therapist gives. And you could give almost any kind of intervention. And if the person matches these criteria, they will tend to do better, as opposed to someone who isn't very verbal, who is stupid. This is the acronym that they use, and who isn't on board with
Wait,
the
there's an
therapist
acronym that
framing.
spells out stupid?
No, that they use stupid is one of the words in the acronym. I can't remember exactly what the acronym
Oh,
is.
I see.
Anyway, so it's basically people who are who are verbal, intelligent, and so on, versus people who are not as intelligent, not as verbal, that sort of thing. These people tend to do better. And so if you have studies that where you've kind of carefully selected patients who are likely to do well, you're not comparing the same populations. You're not comparing people. You're not matching populations, the people who've got the intervention, the people who didn't. So there's that issue. The other one is that studies of efficacy tend to be done by people who are invested already in the outcomes. And when you have studies that are done by people that are not invested in the outcomes, they tend to do worse. They tend to have worse outcomes. And then also, it takes a lot of time to really good studies with large populations. And often when an intervention is introduced, there'll be a lot of fanfare around it. You'll have some initial small studies that show promise, and then this becomes a goad to kind of introduce it. And it might take 10 years to gather data on that particular thing. So one example is mindfulness in schools. So they implemented a mindfulness program in a bunch of schools in the UK. And then they did this enormous study. Which is interesting about it is that the study was done by people who are invested in the outcomes. So you know that, like, in spite of themselves, it showed no effect. And in fact, things might have actually got worse on their indicators. And they were very open in admitting this, and the largest kind of that mindfulness interventions in schools didn't work and may have actually worsened some indicators. It's hard to draw a causal link. There might, in all likelihood, it just didn't have any effect. And they make very big promises on a lot of these interventions, and so they were very open about that. But they were still sort of like unwilling to let it go. They were like, oh, well, maybe we didn't try hard enough, and maybe we didn't do this, and we have to implement it better, and this sort of thing. It's a very common story across these kinds of therapeutic fads. It goes all the way back to the self-esteem movement. At the very beginning of the self-esteem movement, the California Self-Esteem Task Force found that across all of the studies that they looked at, there was no effect. They right from the very beginning, before self-esteem sort of blew up, they knew that the science wasn't there, and yet they couldn't accept it because they were so invested in that. They were like, well, the thing is, self-esteem causes so much that it's actually very difficult to do any study because it's just there all the time anyway. So it causes everything. So they're like, we didn't find an effect because actually it affects everything. That was their, and of course, over time, it became clear that these studies didn't deliver. And then you just move on to the next thing. There's no shortage of fads, and we've talked about this in detail, so I won't go into it again.
Well, let me ask you about
health thing.
Yeah, on the student.
But yeah, so just to sort of reiterate the answer to your question, which is that it's very, very difficult to show how efficacious interventions are. And I'm not 100% sure that a lot of the interventions that they do introduce, like embedding well-being in the curriculum, and the whole university approach, have very much, first of all, they don't have a lot of studies, good quality studies showing a positive effect. And I'm not 100% sure whether or not universities are really tracking the effect of particular interventions. It might be up to individual program coordinators or academics or whatever to do studies on how effective it is. And they probably will just publish in pedagogical journals and that sort of thing. So there's a general kind of lack of tracking. And people may not know what I'm talking about when I just mentioned the whole university approach. In the UK, student mental health was constructed as being in such a crisis that it had to be the number one priority. And indeed, it was Sam Gima said that it had to be more important than knowledge, that we had to just forget about this idea that universities were sites of knowledge. They were there to help people's mental health and well-being. That's, for me, when I heard that, I thought it's a huge holding center. That's what you want. You want a big holding center for young people for whom society has no use at the moment. And you just want to like support them while they're there. That's the message.
Well, I tell you,
is got across.
What strikes me about that is when you do that, then one of the ways you could maybe measure the significance and impact of mental health interventions has been taken away. Because one of the things I would ask is there any evidence indicating that graduation rates increase or that the average GPA of the students is on the rise when there is enough funding for mental health services at a university? Can you tell the difference between those universities that offer an array and substantial mental health interventions and those who don't in terms of graduation rates and GPA? And if you say the aim of the university is no longer to produce knowledge, then you're sort of saying we want to have a different metric for success altogether at the university other than these traditional knowledge-based measurements that are associated with university learning or with education in general. But it would seem to me that when you have someone going to a therapist often enough that they'll have symptoms, right, that they want to overcome. So if you're a student and one of your symptoms is maybe social anxiety, you'd want to overcome your social anxiety and be able to attend classes with less anxiety and maybe more often. Want to overcome your fear of speaking in front of crowds, perhaps, because you have to give presentations. There would be symptoms that are blocking you from achieving goals in your life. And then we could find out, like, to what degree have they overcome those symptoms? Have those symptoms gone away? Like if let's say you're OCD, one of your symptoms is perpetual constant hand washing. If your metric for judging the success of a psychological therapeutic intervention would be how does the patient feel subjectively, then you might say, I have helped them accept their ritualistic hand washing. And, you don't even have to say, and I've helped them develop techniques of scheduling and planning so that they can accomplish all their goals and incorporate the ritualistic hand washing into their life so it doesn't interfere. You don't even have to do that. You can just say they feel better about their ritualistic hand washing and their symptoms. So I wonder if there's been any attempt to track association between higher GPAs or higher graduation rates to mental health services being offered.
Yeah, of course they will try to make these kinds of claims, but generally they have found, like with all of these sorts of fads, that it's very difficult, first of all, anyway, even if there was an effect, it's hard to prove. Like correlation doesn't prove causation, right? Because you've got so much going on and how many people are accessing services and to what extent, what services, because there's a humongous, this is one of the outcomes of the British Academy study.
Yeah, and mental health services could be,
there's such a diffuse array of interventions
mental health
available.
Services at a university could be a proxy for wealth of both the student body and the amount of funding for the university overall.
And this is exactly what happened. So universities with larger endowments were able to make bigger claims about their support on offer. And then it became a form of kind of regulatory capture where they would lobby for, universities have a duty of care and blah, 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 and more support, because they knew they could offer it, whereas their competitors couldn't. And their competitors were like, this is getting crazy. Like the amount of support that is supposed to be available, how many counselors we're supposed to hire for students. And then you get, some universities responded by trying to what we have at Swansea is like you have an academic mentor system or a personal tutor. Now we've reverted back, where you get assigned a bunch of students and you're supposed to be their point of contact. And then that becomes a kind of, it's not supposed to be, but it becomes like you are this student's de facto therapist, and they will come to you with all sorts of problems. Academics, being autistic as we are, become very uncomfortable with this, but also it hands off risk to the academic, right? So like you're supposed to be watching these students and you're like, I don't know, I can't do that. What does that even mean? And I think underneath all of this is the institutions are actually afraid of risk. That's why. So I'll come back to this concept of risk and what's going on with that. But what they are, part of it is that the counseling bodies were demanding that they expand their scope in universities, and they were demanding for more and more hiring of more and more counselors. And this is really expensive, really expensive. And students, when they think of mental health support, they think of one-to-one counseling, of course, because this is what you're kind of told you need. But that's extremely expensive, having to hire these, trained professionals and keep them on call sometimes all night. And so they started to try to get porters, in the dorms trained in mental health services. And they just started sort of diffusing the risk across the university because the cost became astronomical, became very, very high. And so the kind of support available, yes, a richer university is going to be able to provide it. But what all the universities started to do is they started to try to diffuse it across. So they started to get academics involved in, this academic mentoring system, which they said, don't worry, it's not about psychological support, but really it is. And then they train students in mental health first aid, and they have all these apps, and they have monitoring apps and surveillance apps and all sorts of things that are there. And the reason is, and then you get bouncy castles and puppy things and all this sort of stuff that makes it into the news, where then they start saying, oh, students are like children, blah, blah, blah. But the reason why they're doing that is because one of the big claims that advocates were making around this notion of a student mental health crisis was that if they failed in their duty of care, students would commit suicide. And so they played on what we call communities of fate. The sector is a community of fate. When something bad happens to one university, let's say there's a suicide at one university, it goes into the news, that affects the whole sector negatively. And so they played on that, and they said, look, if you don't invest in our services, students are going to commit suicide, and that's going to look really bad on the sector. And so that's why universities were quite open to this. And of course, universities are always risky kind of spaces. They are liminal spaces. They're in between. They're fun, but they're also dangerous. And you've got young people not fully socialized, a lot of drinking, a lot of sex. This can be quite dangerous, again, to the community, the institutions as a community of fate. And so a lot of this support is actually surveillance. It's to say, look, we had these things in place. We did what we could so that they don't get sued. And so they big up these risks. Now, before I went into all of this, I should say there isn't a student mental health crisis. And that's the key to understand here. One, as I spoke about at the very beginning, we have been encouraging help seeking for, 50, 60 years. But young people have been experienced a targeted kind of, you must seek help no matter how small. As a good citizen, you self-surveil and you seek help from professionals. You shouldn't try to deal with your problems on your own. Problems are for professionals. And you see this just like permeating into the culture, where people will, friends will come to each other with problems, and they'll be like, I am not, what do they say? I will not do the emotional labor to blah, blah, blah. Because they have there's this sort of cultural idea that this is something that should be paid for, that this is something that is very professionalized. And so help seeking has become institutionalized and is a very powerful cultural code. And so young people have been, especially students in universities, have been seeking help in much higher numbers, as I said, since the early 2000s. And as they sought help in higher numbers, that became evidence that advocates in these lobby groups used to say that there was a mental health crisis. So they told them, seek help no matter how small, for problems no matter how small. And then when they did that, they said, oh my God, all these students are coming seeking help. We have a crisis, right? And this was then, oh, you need to fund more. You need to hire more counselors. You need to buy. And as it started to proliferate and more people sort of, there's a new area of interest, a new problem construction, you get more and more people coming on board. You get Headspace targeting students for these mindfulness apps. It becomes this, everybody jumps on board. Like, oh yeah, there's this crisis. So that's the first thing. The first way that they sort of constructed a crisis was that students were seeking help. But of course, even the Royal College of Psychiatrists noted that students seek help in higher numbers, regardless of the fact that they do not experience diagnosable conditions at a higher rate than the general population of the same age, and in fact, slightly less. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is this idea that they will commit suicide if universities don't act. And they just sort of assumed, these lobby groups, counselors, and then mental health charities, and they specifically also sought out students to take hold of this agenda and push for it. It's a very common thing, right? Something is top down. University administration was very much on board before students were. So university, it was like, oh no, the problem is that students aren't on board. So let's encourage the students to create these student mental health societies, and then they can campaign. So they basically got people to lobby them for policies they wanted anyway. And why were universities open to that? As I said before, because it depoliticizes issues. It becomes another sort of part of the package that is offered. It allows for this surveillance and this control of risk and so on. So they liked this mental health framing. They didn't like when they knew right from the very beginning that if they were successful in getting students to self-surveil and seek help constantly, really for surveillance purposes, that I'm not saying they openly said it was for surveillance purposes, but I think underneath it all, it was to reduce risks, that the cost could get really high. So they knew that from the very beginning. So there's always this pushback between the lobby groups and the university. While the universities were on board, they were open to the idea of like, yeah, everything's mental health, but everyone's also responsible for mental health. Everyone's responsible for academics are responsible for mental health. Porters at the dorms are responsible for mental health. We can have apps, we can have AI do all of this stuff. But anyways, the idea, one of the things that lobby groups were pushing with was suicide. And they were saying, and every time that there was a student suicide, they would publicize it. And, if you're very organized, newspapers don't generally care about a particular social problem. They care that something is new, novel, eye-catching. So if you are organized around an issue and you have ownership of it, when something happens, you can sort of take that and package it as just one instance of a broader social problem, the student mental health crisis. So when there were student suicides, they would publicize them. And so you got this sense that there was like a student, a suicide epidemic. But at least in the UK, the Office for National Statistics released in 2018 some experimental data, and they released another one in 2020, which showed that actually suicide rates for students are much, much lower than the general population of the same age. If you are not a student, your risk is 2.7 times higher. And I know that risk ratios are a bit shite, but generally the rate per 100,000 is very, very low. And it's lower the younger the students, which is interesting because in my research, what we call typifying stories, the stories that people tell at the beginning of a newspaper article that catch your attention, they were always of very young students who unfortunately took their own lives. That's very, very uncommon. The most common students to take their own lives are mature students and older students. And it gets lower and lower the more that you go down. So you could have a headline when those stats were released. You could have the headline that going to university significantly cuts your risk of suicide. You could have a headline in 2020 that said suicide rates in universities have been declining. But that's not what happened. What's interesting is that when those initial ONS statistics were released, the papers retained the same framing as the claims makers, as the advocates and the lobby groups had, the sort of mental health lobby, which was that there was an epidemic. So they would take the year with the lowest number, and then they would compare it with the year of the highest number, and they would say, oh, the rate has doubled. Now, a little trick for you, if you want to be critical when you read the news, you should know if something has doubled, you need to know what the initial number is, because it's very easy for low numbers to double, right? If there's one, you have two, this sort of thing. And the ONS release explicitly stated that that kind of conclusion could not be drawn because the numbers were so low. So they would pick particular years, but whatever year you picked, you could draw all kinds of conclusions. Oh, look, the rate has fallen by this much, or the rate. And so, but they picked the most pessimistic possible framing, when on the whole, the numbers are low. Numbers are much lower for the general population of the same age, and they have been declining. So
it's a really
no university suicide epidemic, as the newspapers were claiming.
Yeah, all in all, it's an unjustified claim that there is a mental health crisis. The approaching social problems, or even the problems in individual students' life as mental health issues, tends to basically desubjectivize or turn the people, students or otherwise, into passive recipients of life rather than active agents in their life. We are presuming that the primary issue is how people handle the emotional stress of sets of conditions which are immutable and unchangeable and unchanging, or that are, at least if they are changing, they're trending towards intensification of stress and isolation and alienation and so forth. And so the way to handle that is to treat those symptoms, those subjective responses.
I love how you just immediately go to this medicalized framing, like symptoms and treatment. Like, how is something that is so human a symptom that requires a treatment? And also, you're just assuming that there is a treatment that is somehow.
I'm just talking about this in the terms of the ideology. I'm just saying, rather than considering people as active agents or having an ability to change their conditions, we presume that the conditions they're either unchanging or the trend is inexorable, fated, that we are going to continue to have an intensification of stress that will lead to symptoms such as anxiety and ennui and suicide and so forth. Those things, I do believe, are symptomatic, or at least they are the result of poor conditions. Like when the Soviet Union collapsed, you saw an increase in premature death and suicide. When people didn't have prospects for any kind of good future or a way to participate in society, when they didn't have jobs, then they tended to off themselves at a high rate.
And moving off of university campuses, it's important to note that on the whole, in most countries, the suicide rate has been declining. But in countries where it has been rising, the number one cause or like issue that is related to it is economic problems. And I remember this during the pandemic, when people were like, no, the right to life is the most important thing. It's the most important thing. Like, at least you're still alive. And so I always remember this comment. Someone was like, yeah, nobody stands outside, their house being foreclosed or their business being shut down or their bankruptcy being certified or whatever and says, well, at least I'm alive. No, they are at the edge at that point, right?
Yeah.
And so this like material reality is extremely important and can get lost in this sort of health framing.
Right. Listen, I want to run an ad now. We have this is the last one. The wonderful people at the School of Materialist Research have been supporting us as sponsors. It's the kind of sponsorship that I am glad to get. The bunch of dirty, rotten commies over there at the School of Materialist Research trying to educate the youth, not on how they can become mentally well, but how they can change the material basis of society. And here is that ad.
The School of Materialist Research is a self-sustainable platform where ideas are discussed in ways that would not be possible in conventional academia. The school is defined by its interest in the materialist approach to knowledge. Among its faculty are Julia Kristeva, Amanda Beach, Ben Woodward, Thomas Nail, and Paul Cockshott. The deadline for applications is September 4th, 2023. Check out the link to the School of Materialist Research in the description for this video.
You know what? I want to correct that again. I have a different version that I'm running on the uploaded videos that correctly states that today, September 11th, is the final day to apply. That's the real deadline. They extended it, but I have this older version of the ad still loaded up in StreamYard. So let me correct that. It is September 11th. That is today. Oh, by the way, yeah, September 11th. You know, I at least say something like I remembered. Never forget.
Right. So I wanted to make the point also that I am not arguing against counseling services on campuses. As I said, they're the new age confessional. I think they play an important role in young people's lives when you're just like lost, searching for yourself, and you need something. You need a connection to the outside. You know, it's easy to get lost in yourself, you know, especially as a young person and going into totally new networks. I'm not downplaying that. But what I think is the issue is that in trying to expand to absolutely everything, expand definitions and create a kind of symptomology and redefine feelings as mental health problems so that everybody comes to, you know, it's now everybody. You know, you went from like 1 in 4 will be affected by mental health issues in their lifetime. Now it's everybody. What winds up happening is the people who do need professional support and intervention and high quality care as well are not helped by being stuck in the back of a queue behind tons and tons of people on these waiting lists. And the other thing that happened too is perhaps we don't have time to go into this. Yes, we do. The other thing that happened as well is that there's a very subtle redefinition going on, because what the universities are happy for you to send to their millions of different apps and services and surveillance and all these sorts of things is mental health issues, not serious problems, not a disorder. That's supposed to go elsewhere. So if you look at the well-being pages of universities, they often carry a disclaimer that says this is not healthcare. And it's not just at universities. If you go into the whole mental health ecosystem that exists online of this proliferation, this sort of well-being industry, this mental health industry, they will have like pictures of people in white lab coats and so on. And they say, oh, your healthcare choice for psychological blah, blah. It's a travesty that we do not have enough mental health support. The funding is terrible. Buy our app, blah, blah, blah. And then the disclaimer says this is not intended as a treatment. This is not intended as a healthcare, even though they will say like you need healthcare, something I talk about in the book. And so it's this whole aura of health. But when it gets down to it, things that arguably should be medicalized. Okay, we can have a whole argument about Thomas Satz and the medicalization of, you know, the myth of mental illness and that sort of thing. No, leave that aside. That arguably are very helpful to be medicalized, that they don't want. That gets pushed downstream. And there's a very interesting thing going on with the institutions, with universities and the NHS in the UK, where all these claims makers are saying, oh, the universities are not dealing with their duty of care, you know, spending tons and tons on mental health, right? But they're not dealing with their duty of care. And so we have to pick up the burden. We have to pick up the slack. Because when a student has a serious problem, the university is like, oh, no, that's for a GP. That's for a medical doctor. But then the GPs are like, no, we don't want you. Go to the universities. So they're bouncing these people around who have serious issues and cannot get any support at all. And this is the other thing that happens when you expand it and widen it, and why I argue that this kind of reveals that underneath it all, it is about surveillance and not about a sort of benevolent desire to offer support.
Yeah, we should in the second half talk about um, other aspects of the what I think of as a control society, and this is certainly part of it. But I want to also uh, push back on you a little bit here, not about your overall picture of the so-called mental health crisis on campus, but uh, on your claim not to be against counseling on campus. When you say that it is a new age version of the confessional,
Mm-hmm.
that is not how it's being sold. Okay, that is
Yeah.
it. And if you want to have confessionals, they could set those up in a way that would be far less expensive. You could just play up whatever the religious institutions might be on campus. Usually there's like a temple or a church or something that is nearby for students, often enough anyway. Now, admittedly, when I went to college, I went to one that had a Christian denomination to it, not because of that, but it just happened to. So maybe not all campuses have a youth ministry on campus, but I think a lot of them do. So why don't you just make sure that that those people have a couple extra dollars. They can set up a confessional. You can go in and confess your sins and leave it at that.
Well, the reason why therapy is the new age confessional is because of the decline of religion. That's the whole point, right? That
yeah, but just call it what it is, and
it
could be any.
do not go. The authority of the priest is gone now.
Yeah, just invite in a few people to lead meditation seminars, or
They do.
they can
They
well,
do.
but not as therapy, but like as religion, or uh, it could be like a variety of bring in the Scientologists, bring in the Hare Krishnas, bring in Islamic uh, uh, religious leaders, and you can have your pick. Like, how would you like to deal with your feelings of sin and meaninglessness? And then you could go to one or the other, and it would probably cost less because you wouldn't bother to track it scientifically. They wouldn't have to, um, uh, you know, they couldn't refer anyone anywhere else. They wouldn't be dealing with people who had actual mental health issues. It wouldn't be framed that way. It would just be, part of the common human condition. So yeah, I think that if you once you say that this is a new age version of the confessional, a symptom of the loss of religious faith, then you are saying I'm against it. Because whether regardless of whether or not you think religion is a good or a bad thing. I mean, I happen to think a secular society is preferable to a religious society. I'm but but I also think people should have religious freedom. But yeah, I
Well,
mean,
that's exactly it. Like it's for the same reason that I don't argue against people having religion. I just think it's you want to go back to Marx. We argue against religion not because we want people to bear their problems without any kind of consolation, but because we want them to pick a living flower. And so, yeah, I would prefer if there was a world in which we didn't seek out these consolations and we instead sought to pluck the living flower. I would that's preferable. But I just think that's a battle maybe not worth winning. That I understand the people will want these consolations. And I think it makes more sense to kind of, rather than rail against the rise of these new confessionals where the old ones have died because of secularization, it's better to kind of understand that that's what they are, to explain that that's what they're doing to people, and allow people to entertain that thought and decide whether for themselves that's what they want. For me, I think that outside of serious kind of clinical issues that are much better dealt with medication and so on, I tend to think it is much better to search for some kind of meaning in your life or something beyond the self. I think excessive self-attention is not a good thing. Excessive attention to one's feelings is not good for oneself. That's generally what I think. But I do recognize that these things become powerful because there is a loss of meaning. There is a loss of networks. There is a loss of informal supports. And so what are you going to do? What are people going to do? They're not going to fare very well sat in a dark room on their phones, which is where a lot of people are. So, I wouldn't argue against it, but I just want to be real about what it is.
Well, In the United States, there's a separation
Also, there were a
between.
couple of super chats that I wanted to respond to.
Okay, we should respond to them. But in the United States, there's a separation between church and state. So if you are suggesting that the therapy culture is fundamentally religious, then at the very least, there shouldn't be any governmental institutions to advocate. I mean, we wouldn't allow for there to be the branch of Catholic or of Catholic thought within the U.S. Federal government. And if we're saying that therapy is a form of religion, then we shouldn't allow for that to be institutionalized within the state either.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say like every single intervention, like I wouldn't have such broad brushstrokes. I'm saying like for the claims that are made that there are these, that your feelings are actually mental health problems and you should take a huge amount of these problems to a professional, I think this is not good. However, I recognize that there are some interventions, while controversial, are efficacious to a lot of people, especially, as I said, in the absence of other kinds of supports. So it's not like clear cut that this is all pseudoscience. There's a heck of a lot of pseudoscience, but there's also a heck of a lot of good stuff going on. Like, I think sociology is fucking ridiculous in so many ways. Our whole discipline's been, it's full of woo and all this sort of thing. But that doesn't mean there isn't really good sociology, and that we should kind of like rank sociology with the religions. You just have to recognize that there are some weaknesses here.
Okay, so I see two super chats. One is Boar Have.
So Boar Have says,
£5. Thank you, Boar.
Thank you very much. And so he or she or they or whatever says, couldn't such criticisms be made to all social interventions? Even social care has a poor evidence base to support it. Yeah, and that's that. This is the big issue. This is the big issue. There are very few interventions that work. Very few. And in spite of the enormous promises made for whole professions, they do very little. They make very little dent in a lot of the problems that they claim to be able to solve. They can make a dent in some other things, but not in these sort of big, what we call wicked issues. They're just really stubborn to change. And there are some issues, arguably, that cannot be solved within capitalism. But there is you have to promise to be able to solve them. Right? You will never solve material inequality within capitalism. It cannot be solved. Right? But you can bang on and on about that. You can reframe it. You can, talk, subtly change it to mean something else, whatever. There's a huge market for that. So what's happened, and this is the argument that I make in my book, is that knowing there's like this subtle awareness that a lot of these interventions just don't work. But also we've never been able to move beyond these wicked issues. We've never been able to create this great society where want is abolished and so on. And so what happens is we just look deeper, deeper and deeper into the self, into the individual, into childhood, into the makeup of the individual, into our biology, into all sorts of things, our genes, our brains, our brain scans. We just search deeper and deeper into the individual, the child, the baby, the parent, and so on, for solutions that work. And they don't work because some of these things are insoluble. But there's, Joel Best writes.
Hold on. Let's move on to the next question.
Well, I was going to go into why we have this ethos of like soluble problems, and I'll go into Joel Best and the Enlightenment and so on, but I'll just make a note for that for the second hour.
Yeah, second hour. But it says, but the right wing would say that terms like privilege or white supremacy also have non-serious mutable definitions, which don't really help. Yeah, I agree that I would say that the framing of white supremacy as a major issue in society today, or privilege as a major problem in society today, are both specifically designed to lead away from making structural or economic or political changes to alter the way society functions. I mean, I would say both of those frames for how to think of the problem in society lead away from socialism. If the problem is white supremacy, then the problem is can either be thought of as the way
a race. The problem is a race of people hoarding privilege.
It could be thought of.
Oh my God, where did that go wrong in the past? I'm sorry.
It could be thought of as yes, that's right. It could be thought of as the ways in which laws and economic factors tend to elevate certain, the ethnic majority in the United States, say, right, which is still right at the moment majority white. Although definitions of race are changing all the time. But then if you look into that, it's like it's unclear to the degree to which whites, the ethnic majority, are truly the most privileged race in society. There's a variety of races in the country, and some do very, very well and some do less well. And how do you make these definitions? It's unclear. Otherwise, though, if you're talking about white supremacy as a primary problem, then you're talking about the ideas in people's heads, the way people feel about or think about their race being the main problem in society. And the privilege thing is similar. It's mostly comes down these days to it can either be something objective like white people are given preferential treatment overall in society, and I think there are some studies to show that that's
Obviously
the case in terms of like job interviews and applicants for various positions of authority.
Not getting shot.
Yeah, well, but no. Once you get into that terrain, now you have to ask the question: okay, to what degree is that correlation or causation? But the other thing would be thinking about things again in terms of how people perceive their own privilege. Of course, originally these kinds of critiques, the critique of white supremacy, the critique of privilege, was aimed at the working class, and it was always couched as a way of understanding the way the white workers were tricked into working against their own interests. Like, their white privilege or their feelings of white supremacy were what kept them from cooperating and banding together with other races within the working class to take on the class system itself. So by splitting up the races and putting one racial category in a superior position, you kept the working class from organizing collectively together as a class. So if there's a reason to get rid of white supremacy and white privilege, it would be because it's primarily an illusion. There would be a much better life for white people in a world where these divisions were erased and where they could work together with working class people of all races to change the conditions in society. And so it's not a matter of, white people have it too good. It's that these little peanuts that they're given for being white are keeping them from trying to take the whole prize with the rest of their class of various races. So anyway, that's the way I would think about privilege and white supremacy. Obviously, there is a problem, a small problem, meaning it's a very big problem in the people where it exists, but there's not very many people like this, of people who are ideologically white supremacists who actually want an ethno-state and stuff.
Well, yeah, I wouldn't deny that it's kind of growing, but it's still tiny and marginal. But, its existence, I feel like people need its existence to justify their insanity. But anyway, let's go to the Patreon to discuss.
Okay, yeah. I want to run one more thing before we go. This is going to be the framing for the Patreon. It's a clip from a Zizek film called The Pervert's Guide to Ideology. I'm wearing a Jaws t-shirt, and because I'm wearing the Jaws shirt, I thought about this as a way to frame a conversation about free speech and civil rights, and in the second half, but it's not in the usual. We're not framing it in the usual way here. Here's this clip.
Ordinary Americans, as ordinary people in all countries, have a multitude of fears. We fear all kinds of things. We fear maybe immigrants or people whom we perceive as lower than ourselves, attacking us, robbing us. We fear people raping our children. We fear natural disasters, tornadoes, earthquakes, tsunamis. We fear corrupted politicians. We fear big companies which can basically do with us whatever they want. The function of the shark is to unite all these fears so that we can, in a way, trade all these fears for one fear alone.
So yeah, we're going to be talking about the way the progressive state, the capitalist state, the neoconservative state is using the threat of Trump as a way to justify attacks on all of us, and a way to simplify a variety of social problems, so that rather than addressing them, we can get distracted into a war on a phantom, really. And we can talk about that.
And also, I want to talk about too, about not only fear, but supposed to fear. Not just that you really are afraid, you are supposed to be afraid. And this explains a lot of anxiety, the rise of anxiety. I'm going to talk about that. Anyway, sorry.
If you're not properly afraid of Trump, then you're a bad person. I'll cop to that. So we'll see you in the parrot room in about 5 to 10 minutes, and we will.
We do 5 minutes.
5 minutes.
I got to put my kids to bed. School started.
yeah. So 5 minutes, and I'll put a link to that second half in the description for this video and as a comment. So join us there.